Within any given molecule, the electrons are grouped together in very special localized positions. They're grouped together in pairs within bonds, or they're grouped together in pairs within lone pairs of electrons, non-bonding pairs. The Vesper model for predicting molecular shapes relies on the fact that these electron pairs, these electron groups, repel one another. The Vesper model basically says that you can predict the shape by imagining any central atom with other atoms around it as a sphere, and the different groups of electrons, which we call electron domains, are arranged around that sphere in order to minimize the repulsions between the different groups of electrons, between the different electron domains. And to predict shapes, we can follow a simple set of rules. The first one being, draw the Lewis structure for the molecule. In our examples, we've already done this. We've drawn ammonia on the left and formaldehyde on the right. The next step is to count the electron domains. We'll consider the example of ammonia right now. Electron domains are sets of electrons. These can be bonding sets or they can be lone pair sets. In ammonia, we have 4 sets of electrons, or 4 electron domains. We have 3 bonding domains and 1 non-bonding domain. The third step is to predict the electron domain geometry based on the number of domains. The way you predict the electron domain geometry is by counting the number of domains. And there's a correlation between number of domains and the electron domain geometry. 4 electron domains implies a tetrahedral electron domain geometry. The geometries based on a different number of domains are all listed in your textbook. The fourth step in determining the shape of the molecule is to use the arrangement of bonds to determine the molecular geometry. Determining the molecular geometry has to be done based on the electron domain geometry. The electron domain geometry essentially provides a baseline shape that is then modified by the molecular geometry. The molecular geometry only cares about the arrangement of atoms in space, so it only cares about the number of bonding domains. For a baseline tetrahedral electron domain geometry, if you have 3 bonds and 1 non-bonding pair, you have a trigonal pyramidal shape. And again, these shapes can all be found in tables within your textbook. Once we've determined the molecular geometry, we know something about the bond angles within that molecule. So we know something about the 3-dimensional shape of the molecule. Within a tetrahedral electron domain geometry, we know that all of the bond angles have to be equivalent. They're all 109.5 degrees. This kind of shape would give you a tetrahedral or pyramidal type shape. But we know one of the domains is non-bonding and only 3 of them are bonding. So this gives us a shape that's essentially pyramidal, a triangular-based pyramid. We've just removed the upper non-bonding domain and we're left with 3 bonds that give you a triangular shape. The geometry for this is based off of the electron domain geometry, and it means that the bond angles are going to be very close to 109.5. The only difference now is that we have to incorporate the idea that certain domains will repel one another more strongly than other domains. So the electrons that are located within bonds are held to a very strict location range, and electrons that are in non-bonding pairs can cover a lot more space, and non-bonding pairs end up repelling more than bonding pairs. So what happens is your non-bonding pairs actually push down on the bonds. So the lone pair, the non-bonding pair, is pushing down on the triangular arrangement of hydrogen atoms, and it actually reduces the bond angle to something less than 109.5. And without doing any detailed calculations or certain types of experiments, we can't actually identify the specific angle. We simply know that it will be less than 109.5 degrees. If we look at something structurally very similar to the ammonia, if we look at methane, methane also has 4 electron domains from our 4 bonds, but it does not have any non-bonding domains. So its electron domain geometry is exactly the same as in ammonia. It's tetrahedral. And because all of those domains are bonds, it also has a molecular geometry of tetrahedral. And since the electron domain geometry requires bond angles of 109.5 degrees, and the molecular and electron domain geometries are the same. The bond angles are also 109.5 for the molecular geometry. The formaldehyde molecule can be examined similarly. We have the central carbon atom that's surrounded by hydrogens and oxygen, and we've drawn a Lewis structure, and we can count the electron domains. It may look like there are 4 domains around this carbon, but in fact, there are really only 3. Single bonds and double bonds all count as an individual electron domain. Instead of having only 2 electrons between the carbon and the oxygen to make a single bond, we have 4 electrons between the carbon and the oxygen to make a double bond. Even though there are more electrons, they're still located in a very restricted space between those 2 atoms, so they count as a single domain. If there are 3 domains, we can determine our electron domain geometry from the table in the textbook, and it is a trigonal planar geometry. And then our next step is to use the bonding domains to determine the molecular geometry. Here the number of bonding domains and the number of electron domains are the same. 3 bonds, 3 domains, so the molecular geometry is also trigonal planar. If you place 3 things around a central atom and you try and repel those from each other as far as possible, the bond angles you get are 120 degrees. So the bond angles for an electron domain geometry of trigonal planar are 120 degrees. Because the electron domain and molecular geometries are the same, you might expect the bond angles to be the same for both electron domain and molecular geometry as well. But just like how lone pairs can repel more than single bonds, double bonds also repel more than single bonds. So the double bond pushes down on the single bonds, and now you have something that resembles an isosceles triangle, and you have 2 angles that are greater than 120 degrees and 1 angle that is slightly less than 120 degrees. If you have a molecule that's a little bit more complicated, like propadiene, you can't assign a geometry to the whole molecule like you could where there was only a single central atom. Here we have 3 central atoms, that is, atoms that have other things bonded to it. The 3 carbons are all central atoms. And since we can't decide on a single geometry for the entire molecule, we can provide geometries around each individual central atom. If we look at the first carbon atom, we can do the same kind of thing that we did for determining the shapes of our simpler examples. This carbon has 3 electron domains, so it has an electron domain geometry of trigonal planar. And because all 3 of those domains are bonding domains, it has a molecular geometry of trigonal planar. The third carbon, which is also a central atom, also has trigonal planar geometries. 3 electron domains, 3 bonding domains, trigonal planar. And because we know the molecular and electron domain geometries, and we know which bonds are single and which bonds are double, we can assign approximate bond angles as well. And the angles would be symmetrical, so the third carbon would have similar bond angles. Our central carbon atom, our central atom, has only 2 domains. 2 domains give you a linear structure. The easiest way to arrange 2 things around a central point is to put them 180 degrees apart from each other. You end up with a linear system. So this is a linear EDG. Because both of these domains are bonding domains, it also has a linear molecular geometry. Anything that is linear has bond angles of 180 degrees.